The hum of the engine was the only sound that filled the quiet interior of the sleek black sedan as it sped down the long, empty highway. The city's bright lights had long since faded from the rearview mirror, leaving nothing but the darkness and an open road ahead. Elijah Walker, captain of the FBI task force, sat behind the wheel with calm confidence, though his mind was far from peaceful. Beside him, his partner, Marcus Hill, remained silent, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, focused but distant. They had been undercover for months, working to dismantle a major international criminal network. Their mission was crucial: drug trafficking, arms smuggling, and organized crime, all tied together under one massive operation. Tonight, they had concluded a meeting with a key informant who had provided the final pieces of evidence needed to bring the criminal empire down. Documents and sensitive files were in the trunk, locked and ready to be used in the upcoming arrests. Despite the success of the operation, the tension between the two men was palpable. The adrenaline from the meeting had worn off, leaving unease. The weight of the night felt heavy, especially as they neared the final stretch of their mission. Both men understood the dangers of their line of work, but there was a unique, silent threat that came with being black in an institution that often viewed them with suspicion. Even after years of dedicated service, Elijah couldn't help but be reminded of the subtle racism they both faced on a daily basis. As they cruised along the highway, Elijah's gaze shifted to the rearview mirror, a nagging feeling creeping up on him. He spotted the familiar glow of blue and red lights flickering in the distance. His heart sank. "We've got company," Elijah said calmly, though his voice had an edge of alertness. Marcus turned and scanned the rear window. His eyes narrowed, and he muttered, "We weren't speeding, were we?" "No," Elijah replied, easing off the gas pedal. "But that doesn't always matter." Both men knew too well that, as black men in the public eye, even as federal agents, every encounter with law enforcement was fraught with risk. It wasn't just about the rules, it was about being in the wrong place, at the wrong time, under the wrong circumstances. They pulled over to the side of the road, and the police cruiser followed suit, its lights casting an eerie glow over the car. "We'll handle this," Elijah said softly, his voice more to reassure himself than Marcus. Two officers emerged from the cruiser. One was tall and lean, with sharp features. The other was older and stockier. Their posture, the way they moved, it was all wrong. This wasn't a routine traffic stop. There was something menacing about the way they approached. The younger officer, his face hard, walked to Elijah's window. "License and registration," he barked, his tone far from professional. Elijah's grip on the wheel tightened slightly. "Is there a problem, officer?" The officer's eyes swept over the car, but he didn't answer immediately. "You were speeding." "We weren't speeding," Marcus interjected sharply. The older officer, whose name tag read Miller, moved to Marcus's side of the car. His hand rested on the holstered weapon, making the tension even more palpable. Elijah could feel the anger rising in Marcus, but he knew it was important to stay composed. After a long, uncomfortable silence, the officers took their documents and retreated to their cruiser. The car was thick with unspoken tension. Elijah glanced at Marcus, who muttered, "This isn't a routine stop." Elijah nodded, his mind already racing. It had happened before, being profiled, pulled over for no reason. Tonight was no different, but the danger felt more real, more immediate. Minutes passed, stretching the silence into something heavy. When the officers returned, their body language had shifted. The younger officer, Officer Miller, looked even more tense. The calm of the night had vanished, replaced by a palpable sense of danger. "Step out of the vehicle," Miller commanded, his hand hovering near his weapon. Elijah's stomach dropped, but he didn't hesitate. "Can you tell us why?" he asked, his voice steady. "You're acting suspiciously," Miller replied coldly, offering no further explanation. This was no longer a routine stop. It was escalating quickly. The office's hostility was thick in the air, and Elijah could feel it. They opened the car doors and stepped out, the weight of the situation pressing on them. As they stood by the car, Elijah could feel the office's cold hostility. The younger officer frisked him, his hands rough, acting suspiciously. Miller muttered, though his accusation was vague and unsubstantiated. It was exactly the kind of baseless claim that could lead to anything. Marcus's frustration grew with each passing second, and Elijah could see his partner struggling to contain it. Miller moved to Jordan with the same aggressive energy, rifling through his pockets, searching for anything, or hoping to find something to justify this harassment. "We weren't speeding," Marcus repeated, his voice tight with barely contained anger. But the officers didn't care. They had already made up their minds. They had already labeled Elijah and Marcus as guilty, just because of the color of their skin. Then, something unexpected happened. Miller reached into the glove compartment, pulling out a folding knife, a perfectly legal tool used for basic tasks, but one that in his hands could serve as a justification for escalation. He waved it in the air. "Look what we found." Miller smirked. "You two aren't as innocent as you think. That's a utility knife," Elijah said calmly, his voice even despite the rush of adrenaline. "It's legal." Miller's face twisted with disdain. "Not when it's in the hands of someone like you," he retorted. The implication was clear. To these officers, the knife wasn't just an object. It was another excuse to demean and criminalize Elijah and Marcus. This wasn't about the knife. It was about making them feel small. It was about making them feel like they didn't belong. Elijah's pulse quickened. They had no choice. He had to act. "Check my back pocket," he said, his voice steady despite the danger. Miller hesitated for a moment before pulling the wallet out. When he flipped it open, his fingers froze as he saw the FBI badge inside. The world seemed to stop. The tension thickened. In that moment, everything changed. They weren't just two black men in a car. They were federal agents. FBI agents. Miller and Brooks stared at the badge, their smugness evaporating. For a moment, they didn't know what to do. Elijah stood still, his hands still resting on the car, his heart pounding but his face impassive. "We're FBI," Elijah said calmly, his voice filled with the quiet authority of someone who had seen too much. "Too often. You've made a big mistake." But even then, the officers didn't back down immediately. They were reluctant to admit their wrongs, their arrogance still evident. But as the tension in the air became undeniable, the officers slowly, reluctantly backed off. The next day, Elijah and Marcus reported the incident to their superior, Special Agent Evelyn Clark. They had to make sure that Miller and Brooks faced consequences, not just for the way they had treated them, but for the risk they had posed to the operation. Clark agreed to open an internal investigation but made it clear that it would have to be done carefully to avoid jeopardizing the mission. "We'll do this by the book," she said firmly, "but trust that we'll hold them accountable." Weeks passed, and the tension continued to build. As the investigation unfolded, the stakes were higher than ever. Elijah and Marcus had to be strategic. They couldn't afford to let their emotions drive them, not with so much at risk. But they couldn't let Miller and Brooks off the hook either. They had to make sure that justice was done. And finally, the breakthrough came. Miller and Brooks were suspended pending further investigation. The department would have no choice but to address what had happened in full. The story was going public. The next day, the media exploded with stories about the racial profiling incident, and the public outcry was swift and intense. Miller and Brooks were officially reprimanded, and the department issued a public statement acknowledging their misconduct. It was a victory, but not the end. As Elijah and Marcus sat in their office, watching the news unfold, they exchanged a quiet look. They had won this round, but the battle for justice, for real change, was just beginning. "We've made it this far," Marcus said, his voice filled with resolve. "We'll make sure it doesn't end here." Elijah nodded, his eyes determined. "This is just the beginning." As the media buzzed with stories of the misconduct and the actions taken by the FBI, Elijah and Marcus sat in silence, watching the chaos unfold. The lights from the television cast shadows on their faces, reflecting the weight of what had transpired. They had fought for justice, and the system, for once, had responded. But deep down, they both knew that this victory was just a small piece of a much larger battle. For all the progress made, there would always be more to do. The road was long and fraught with challenges, and the system would continue to test their resolve. But they had endured, fought for what was right, and refused to back down, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. "We did the right thing," Marcus said softly, breaking the silence as he stared at the screen. Elijah nodded, his eyes steady. "But it's not over. It's never over. This is just the start." In that moment, they both understood something profound, that their fight was bigger than themselves. It wasn't just about the officers they had confronted. or even the operation they had worked so hard to complete. It was about every person who had ever been unjustly treated, every system that had failed them, and every future that they hoped to help shape with their courage. As they stood together, ready to face whatever came next, they knew one thing for sure: they wouldn't stop. Not now, not ever. Because, in the end, real justice doesn't come in a single victory, it comes from the continued fight. The unwavering stand for what's right, and the courage to never back down, no matter how difficult the road ahead.